The morning mist was still clinging to the cobblestones of Windsor Castle when Sergeant Michael Davies began his ceremonial patrol. 23 years of service had taught him to read the crowd before they even knew what they were thinking. Today felt different. The usual respectful tourists were mixed with something else, an energy that made his instincts prickle with unease. Michael adjusted his red tunic and checked his rifle one final time before stepping into the courtyard. His polished boots echoed against the ancient stones as he began the slow, measured march that had been performed by royal guards for centuries. Each step was precise, each movement calculated to represent the dignity and honor of the British crown. Among the gathering crowd, Victoria Pemberton stood out like a peacock among pigeons. Her designer handbag costs more than most people's monthly salary, and her perfectly styled blonde hair hadn't moved, despite the morning breeze. She clutched her phone in one manicured hand while gesturing dramatically with the other, speaking loudly into her wireless earbuds to someone who was apparently very impressed with her current location. "Darling, you simply cannot imagine the quaintness of this place," Victoria announced to her phone, her voice carrying across the courtyard loud enough for dozens of tourists to hear. "I'm literally standing where kings and queens have walked. Of course, I had to pay extra for the VIP tour, but money is no object when you're experiencing real culture." Other tourists glanced at Victoria with mixtures of annoyance and embarrassment. An elderly Japanese couple bowed slightly and moved further away, while a family from Germany quietly shushed their children and pointed toward the approaching guard, hoping to teach them about showing respect in such historic places. Michael continued his patrol, his face a mask of professional composure. He had encountered entitled tourists before, people who seemed to believe that their vacation plans took precedence over centuries of tradition and protocol. Usually, a firm but polite correction from castle security was enough to restore order. But something about Victoria's demeanor suggested this interaction might be different. Dr. James Morrison, a history professor from Edinburgh, was visiting the castle with his teenage daughter Sarah. He had been explaining the significance of the guard's ceremonial duties when Victoria's loud conversation began drowning out his words. James noticed his daughter's expression change from interest to uncomfortable embarrassment as other tourists began staring at their group. "Dad, why is she being so loud?" Sarah whispered, her cheeks reddening as Victoria continued her phone performance just a few meters away. James had spent years dealing with difficult students and disruptive behavior in academic settings, but he recognized that this situation required delicate handling. The setting was too formal, too steeped in tradition, for a direct confrontation to end well for anyone involved. Victoria ended her phone call with a theatrical sigh and immediately began taking selfies, completely oblivious to the growing discomfort of those around her. Her poses became increasingly elaborate, and she stepped backward repeatedly to get better angles, moving directly into the path that Michael was following for his ceremonial patrol. Castle security guard Robert Chen had been watching the situation develop from his position near the main entrance. 20 years of experience had taught him to spot potential problems before they escalated, and Victoria Pemberton was setting off every alarm bell in his professional judgment. He began moving closer, hoping to intercept any issues before they disrupted the ceremony. Michael approached the section of his route where Victoria was now standing, her back turned to him as she continued taking photos. Protocol was clear. The ceremonial patrol could not be interrupted or altered for any reason. Tourists were expected to observe from designated areas and move out of the way when guards approached. This was basic courtesy that had been understood for generations. A hush began to fall over the crowd as they realized what was about to happen. Parents pulled their children closer, and conversations stopped midst. The approaching confrontation between centuries of tradition and modern entitlement was about to play out before their eyes. Victoria remained completely unaware of the building tension. Her social media followers were responding enthusiastically to her posts, and she was basking in the attention. She had moved even further into Michael's path, now standing directly in the center of the route that he was required to follow. Anna Kowalski, a tourist from Poland, tugged gently on her husband's sleeve and pointed toward the situation. They had saved for 3 years to afford this trip to England, and they understood the privilege of witnessing such historic traditions. Anna felt embarrassed for Victoria, but also frustrated that one person's behavior might ruin the experience for everyone else. The crowd's collective breath seemed to hold as Michael drew closer. His pace never wavered, his expression never changed. But those who knew military protocol recognized the subtle signs of a professional soldier dealing with an obstacle in his path. His jaw was slightly tighter, his grip on his rifle infinitesimally more firm. Victoria's phone buzzed with another call, and she answered it immediately, spinning around in a complete circle as she spoke. "Oh my goodness, you should see this adorable little soldier boy marching around. He's like something from a movie. Hold on, let me get a video of him. The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown at the feet of centuries of military tradition. Several tourists actually gasped audibly, while others began pulling out their own phones, not to take pictures, but to potentially document what they sensed was about to become a very serious situation. Michael was now less than 10 meters away from Victoria, still maintaining his ceremonial pace. Robert Chen was moving closer, but he was positioned at an angle that wouldn't allow him to intercept the situation in time. The mathematics of timing and distance were working against any peaceful resolution. Dr. Morrison found himself torn between his role as an educator and his instinct to prevent a public embarrassment. He had taught his students about the importance of respecting cultural protocols, but he also recognized that direct intervention might make the situation worse. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from allowing natural consequences to unfold. The morning sun had burned away the last of the mist, casting sharp shadows across the courtyard stones. The ancient walls of Windsor Castle seemed to watch silently as centuries of protocol prepared to meet 21st century entitlement in a confrontation that nobody wanted but everyone could see coming. Victoria continued her phone call, completely absorbed in describing her surroundings to a distant audience, unaware that she was about to become the center of attention for reasons she never could have anticipated. The gap between tradition and entitlement was closing with each of Michael's measured steps, and silence was beginning to fall across the courtyard like a curtain preparing to rise on an unplanned drama. Victoria Pemberton was in the middle of describing her absolutely divine hotel suite when Sergeant Michael Davies reached the point where protocol demanded action. The centuries-old tradition of the Queen's Guard was crystal clear when obstacles appear in the ceremonial path. Guards do not deviate, do not stop, and do not acknowledge the obstruction. They continue forward with the same measured pace that has defined British military precision for generations. Make way for the Queen's Guard. Michael's voice cut through the morning air with the authority of a man who had served his country in 3 different conflicts. The command was delivered in the traditional manner, loud, clear, and absolutely non-negotiable. It was a warning that had been given the same way for over 200 years. Victoria's phone conversation came to an abrupt halt. She spun around, her designer sunglasses sliding down her nose as she found herself face-to-face with 6 feet of British military tradition. For the first time since arriving at Windsor Castle, she was actually looking at the guard instead of simply using him as a backdrop for her social media performance. "Excuse me." Victoria's voice carried the tone of someone who had never been challenged in a public setting. "I was here first, and I'm taking photos. Can't you just walk around me? This is supposed to be customer service, isn't it?" The crowd that had been watching the approaching confrontation fell into complete silence. Parents covered their children's ears, not because of language, but because they sensed they were about to witness something that would either be historically significant or deeply embarrassing. Mobile phones appeared in hands across the courtyard, but not for the usual tourist photos. Michael continued his advance without breaking stride. His training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Tourist obstruction was covered extensively in guard training, and the protocol was unambiguous: maintain course, maintain dignity, maintain the honor of the crown. Personal feelings, convenience, and civilian demands were irrelevant when weighed against centuries of military tradition. Dr. Morrison found himself leaning forward despite himself, fascinated by the real-time demonstration of institutional authority meeting individual entitlement. His academic mind was already analyzing the cultural dynamics at play, while his parental instincts made him grateful that his daughter was witnessing the consequences of disrespecting established social protocols. Victoria took a step backward, but she remained squarely in Michael's path. Her retreat wasn't driven by respect or understanding, but by the sudden realization that this adorable little soldier boy wasn't going to accommodate her demands. The confusion on her face was visible to everyone watching, as if she couldn't comprehend why her usual tactics weren't working. "This is ridiculous," Victoria announced to the crowd, apparently expecting support from fellow tourists. "I paid good money to be here, and I have every right to take photos wherever I want. This is public property, isn't it?" Robert Chen, the security guard, was now close enough to intervene, but he hesitated. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes the most effective education came from natural consequences rather than official intervention. Victoria was about to learn something that couldn't be taught through warnings or explanations. Anna Kowalski whispered urgently to her husband in Polish, her words rapid and concerned. She had grown up in a country where military traditions were deeply respected, and she could see exactly what was about to happen. Her husband nodded gravely, pulling out his phone not to record the confrontation, but to document what he recognized as a significant cultural moment. Michael was now 3 meters away from Victoria, close enough that his polished boots were clearly visible as they struck the ancient stones with mechanical precision. His rifle remained at the perfect angle, his posture unchanged, his expression as impassive as the castle walls surrounding them. He embodied everything that Victoria's generation often dismissed as outdated formality. The temperature in the courtyard seemed to drop despite the warming morning sun. Conversations that had been conducted in normal tones now became urgent whispers. Tour guides who had been explaining historical facts found themselves witnessing history being made in real time. Victoria's phone buzzed with an incoming call, but for the first time all morning she ignored it. The reality of the situation was beginning to penetrate her bubble of self-importance. This wasn't a customer service interaction where she could demand to speak to a manager. This wasn't a situation where her money, her connections, or her social status provided any leverage whatsoever. "I don't know what your problem is," Victoria said, her voice now carrying a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before. "But I'm not moving. I was here first, and I have rights. You can't just intimidate people because you're wearing a fancy costume." The word costume rippled through the crowd like a physical blow. Several tourists actually winced visibly. Dr. Morrison closed his eyes briefly, recognizing that Victoria had just crossed a line from ignorance into active disrespect. His daughter Sarah grabbed his arm, sensing the shift in atmosphere even if she didn't fully understand its implications. Michael maintained his approach. 2 meters. 1.5 meters. The mathematics of the situation were becoming unavoidable. Victoria would either move voluntarily, or the encounter would escalate in ways that protocol had clearly established. The Queen's Guard did not negotiate, compromise, or accommodate civilian demands when performing ceremonial duties. A tour group from South Korea had stopped their scheduled movement through the castle to observe the unfolding drama. Their guide, Margaret Song, had been explaining British customs and traditions for 8 years, but she had never had such a perfect, real-time example of the collision between individual desires and institutional authority. Victoria's designer handbag, it slipped from her shoulder as she realized that Michael's advance hadn't slowed even slightly. Her perfectly manicured fingers fumbled to catch it, a small crack in the composed facade she had maintained all morning. For the first time, she seemed to understand that this situation might not resolve in her favor. The silence in the courtyard had become so complete that Michael's footsteps echoed off the castle walls like a countdown timer. Each step brought the confrontation closer to its inevitable conclusion, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in their tourist experience. Robert Chen made his decision to let the situation play out naturally. Sometimes the most valuable lessons couldn't be delivered through words or warnings. Victoria Pemberton was about to receive an education in respect, tradition, and consequences that would be far more memorable than any security guard's lecture. 1 meter away, Victoria's eyes widened as she realized that Michael's expression hadn't changed at all. She had expected anger, frustration, or at least some acknowledgement of her presence as an obstacle. Instead, she was facing something far more unsettling: complete professional indifference to her demands and expectations. The moment of truth was arriving with the same inexorable precision that had governed British military tradition for centuries, and silence was falling everywhere as witnesses prepared to see exactly what happened when unstoppable tradition met unmovable entitlement. The collision between Victoria Pemberton and Sergeant Michael Davies happened with a precision that would have been almost comical if it hadn't been so shocking. Michael didn't push, shove, or make any aggressive movement whatsoever. He simply continued his ceremonial march at exactly the same pace he had maintained for the past 10 minutes, as if Victoria weren't there at all. Victoria, who had been standing her ground with stubborn determination, suddenly found herself being moved backward by the steady advance of military discipline. It wasn't violent, it wasn't personal, and it wasn't negotiable. Michael's forward movement was as inevitable as gravity, and Victoria's resistance was as ineffective as trying to argue with the tide. "What are you doing? You can't just push me." Victoria's voice rose to a near shriek, but even as she protested, her feet were sliding backward on the smooth castle stones. Her designer's shoes, chosen for appearance rather than practicality, provided no traction against Michael's advance. The crowd watched in stunned fascination as centuries of protocol played out before their eyes. This wasn't a confrontation in the typical sense. There was no anger, no shouting from the guard, no dramatic gestures. Michael's expression remained completely neutral, his pace unchanged, his rifle held at the exact same angle it had been throughout his entire patrol. Dr. Morrison found himself mentally cataloging every detail of the interaction. For future lectures, this was a perfect example of institutional authority functioning exactly as designed, without emotion or personal investment, simply as an expression of systematic tradition. His daughter Sarah was having never seen an adult forced to face consequences for their behavior in such a public and undeniable way. Victoria's phone fell from her hand as she struggled to maintain her balance while being inexorably moved backward. The device clattered across the stones, its expensive protective case sliding toward a group of German tourists who instinctively stepped aside. The sound seemed to echo through the courtyard like a symbol of her complete loss of control over the situation. Anna Kowalski whispered to her husband, "This is what happens when you disrespect tradition." Her words were in Polish, but the meaning was universal to everyone watching. Cultural arrogance was meeting cultural reality, and the outcome was both predictable and mesmerizing. Robert Chen, still positioned nearby, made no move to intervene. His security training had taught him to distinguish between genuine emergencies and educational moments. Victoria wasn't in any physical danger, but she was receiving a lesson in respect that no amount of money or social status could purchase or avoid. Michael continued his forward movement with mechanical precision. His boots struck the stones with the same rhythm. His breathing remained steady, and his focus stayed fixed on the distant point that marked the end of his ceremonial route. Victoria's presence in his path was being treated exactly as protocol demanded, as a temporary obstacle that would resolve itself through the application of unwavering procedure. "This is assault. This is completely unacceptable. Victoria's protests grew more desperate as she realized that her usual tactics of indignation and demands for special treatment were having absolutely no effect. The guard wasn't responding to her emotional appeals, her threats, or her attempts to make the situation personal. A family from Australia had stopped their self-guided tour to watch the spectacle unfold. The father, a retired police officer named Bruce Anderson, recognized the professional discipline he was witnessing. "That's proper training," he murmured to his wife. "No emotion, no ego, just following procedure exactly as it's meant to be done." Victoria's backward movement became more frantic as she tried to maintain her footing, while being pushed by an immovable force. Her perfect hair was coming loose from its styling. Her designer outfit was becoming wrinkled, and her face was flushed with a combination of exertion and humiliation. The composure she had maintained throughout her morning of entitled behavior was crumbling visibly. Margaret Song, the Korean tour guide, found herself explaining to her group in rapid Korean what they were witnessing. Her words were punctuated by gasps and murmurs of amazement from tourists who understood. They were seeing something extraordinary. This wasn't part of any scheduled castle tour, but it was proving more educational than any formal presentation. The physics of the situation were becoming increasingly apparent to Victoria. Michael outweighed her by at least 40 pounds. His center of gravity was lower, his footing was superior, and his movement was supported by decades of military training. Her resistance was not just futile, it was actively working against her as her backward steps became less controlled and more desperate. "Someone help me. This is crazy." Victoria appealed to the crowd, apparently expecting other tourists to intervene on her behalf. Instead, she was met with a wall of silent observation. Nobody was laughing, nobody was cheering, but nobody was coming to her rescue either. The crowd had instinctively recognized that this was a moment of natural justice playing out. Dr. Morrison realized he was witnessing something that would become a perfect case study for his courses on social psychology and institutional authority. The guard's complete emotional detachment was making Victoria's own emotional escalation appear even more dramatic by contrast. Her loss of control was being highlighted by his absolute maintenance of control. Michael's advance had now moved. Victoria nearly 15 meters from her original position, she was being herded backward like a sheep by a sheepdog. Except the sheepdog in this case was wearing a red military tunic and carrying a rifle. Her attempts to plant her feet and resist had only resulted in her shoes sliding on the smooth stones. The morning sun was now high enough to cast sharp shadows across the courtyard, and Victoria found herself being pushed steadily out of the shade and into the bright sunlight. Even the weather seemed to be conspiring against her comfort and composure. Sweat was beginning to show on her expensive blouse, and her makeup was starting to run slightly. A group of elderly British tourists were watching with expressions that mixed embarrassment with satisfaction. They had grown up respecting institutions like the Queen's Guard, and seeing someone learn that respect the hard way was both uncomfortable and oddly gratifying. One woman whispered to her companion, "About time someone showed these entitled types what real authority looks like." Victoria's backward movement was becoming increasingly unsteady. Her designer shoes were completely unsuited for this type of physical resistance, and her lack of any real athletic conditioning was becoming apparent. Michael, meanwhile, continued his advance with the same mechanical precision he would have maintained if he were marching across an empty courtyard. The inevitable conclusion was approaching rapidly. Victoria was being pushed steadily toward the edge of the ceremonial area, where protocol would presumably allow her to escape the immediate path of the guards' patrol. But the psychological impact of being physically moved against her will by someone who refused to acknowledge her protests or demands was clearly devastating to her sense of personal authority. Silence that had fallen over the courtyard was so complete that every sound seemed amplified. Victoria's labored breathing, Michael's measured footsteps, the whisper of fabric as tourists shifted position to better observe the confrontation. History was being made in real time, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Victoria Pemberton's final moment of resistance came when her heel caught on an uneven stone and she stumbled backward, her arms windmilling desperately to maintain balance. For a brief instant, it appeared she might fall completely, but Michael's steady advance had pushed her to exactly the edge of his ceremonial path, where protocol allowed him to continue without further contact, as if controlled by an invisible switch. Michael's interaction with Victoria ended with the same mechanical precision with which it had begun. The moment she was no longer directly in his path, she ceased to exist in his awareness. His pace remained unchanged, his expression unchanged. His focus shifted seamlessly to the next section of his route as if the previous 2 minutes had never occurred. Victoria stood at the edge of the ceremonial area, breathing heavily, her perfect morning completely destroyed. Her hair had escaped its careful styling, her expensive outfit was wrinkled and slightly torn, and her face bore the unmistakable expression of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally challenged. She looked around the courtyard as if seeing it clearly. For the first time, the silence that had gripped the crowd during the confrontation began to break, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Instead of laughter, mockery, or even sympathy, what emerged was something far more profound. a collective recognition that they had witnessed something significant about respect, authority, and consequences. Dr. Morrison approached Victoria carefully, his academic instincts telling him that this was a teachable moment that could either reinforce or repair the damage that had just occurred. His daughter Sarah followed at a distance, still processing what she had observed about adult behavior and institutional authority. "Are you all right?" Dr. Morrison asked gently, offering Victoria his handkerchief to help her compose herself. His tone carried no judgment, only the kind of professional concern he might show a student who had just experienced a difficult learning moment. Victoria looked at him with eyes that seemed to be seeing the world differently than they had just minutes before. I don't understand what just happened," she said quietly, her voice lacking the confident authority it had carried throughout the morning. He wouldn't stop. He wouldn't even look at me." Anna Kowalski had retrieved Victoria's fallen phone and approached to return it. The device's screen was cracked, a small but symbolic representation of how the morning had gone. As Anna handed it back, she spoke in careful English. "In my country, we learn from childhood to respect the gods. They represent something bigger than themselves." The crowd was beginning to disperse, but not in the usual chaotic tourist fashion. People moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones, many glancing back at Victoria with expressions that mixed concern with contemplation. The morning's entertainment had transformed into something deeper and more uncomfortable than anyone had bargained for. Robert Chen finally approached the group around Victoria, but his demeanor was that of a counselor rather than an enforcer. "Miss, are you injured in any way? Do you need medical attention?" His questions were professional and caring, focused on her well-being rather than any potential complaints she might want to lodge. Victoria shook her head slowly, still trying to process what had occurred. "No, I'm not hurt, not physically." She looked toward where Michael was continuing his patrol, now at the far end of the courtyard, completely absorbed in his ceremonial duties as if the confrontation had never happened. Margaret Song, the Korean tour guide, found herself in an unexpected teaching opportunity with her group. "What we witnessed," she explained in both Korean and English for the benefit of nearby tourists, "is the difference between individual desires and institutional responsibility. The guard wasn't being cruel, he was being consistent." Bruce Anderson, the retired Australian police officer, nodded in agreement. "That's proper training right there. No personal feelings involved, just procedure." The moment it became personal, it would have stopped being professional. Victoria's phone buzzed with messages and missed calls, but she ignored them completely. The digital world that had seemed so important an hour ago now felt trivial compared to the real-world lesson she had just experienced. Her morning of social media performance had been replaced by a profound encounter with consequences. Dr. Morrison recognized an opportunity for genuine education. "Would you like to understand what just happened?" he asked Victoria gently. "I teach history, and what you experienced is actually a fascinating example of how institutional authority works." Victoria nodded slowly, seeming genuinely interested for the first time all morning. The arrogance that had defined her earlier behavior had been replaced by something approaching humility. I thought I could just ask him to move. I thought customer service applied everywhere." "That's the interesting part," Dr. Morrison explained, settling into his teaching mode. "The Queen's Guard aren't customer service representatives. They're active military personnel performing a duty that dates back centuries. Their job isn't to make tourists comfortable, it's to maintain traditions that represent something larger than individual convenience." Sarah Morrison, who had been quietly observing, spoke up hesitantly. "So he wasn't being mean to her, he was just doing his job." "Exactly," her father confirmed. "Personal feelings, individual requests, even politeness becomes secondary when someone is representing institutional authority. The guard couldn't make exceptions without undermining the entire system he represents." Victoria sat down heavily on a nearby bench, the reality of her situation finally settling in. "I made a fool of myself, didn't I?" she asked quietly. "Everyone was watching, and I acted like the rules didn't apply to me." Anna Kowalski sat beside her, her earlier anger replaced by compassion. "We all learn respect in different ways," she said kindly. "The important thing is that you learned it." The crowd around Victoria had grown into an impromptu discussion group, with tourists from different countries sharing their perspectives on authority, respect, and cultural differences. What had begun as a spectacle was transforming into a genuine cross-cultural exchange about values and expectations. Robert Chen listened to the conversation with professional interest. In 20 years of security work, he had rarely seen such a dramatic shift in someone's behavior and attitude. Victoria's transformation from entitled demand to genuine reflection was remarkable and, in his experience, quite rare. Michael completed his ceremonial patrol and began the return journey that would take him past the group again. Victoria watched his approach with completely different eyes than she had an hour earlier. This time, she saw not an obstacle to her desires, but a representative of something enduring and meaningful. As Michael drew near, Victoria stood up and stepped well clear of his path, her movement instinctive and respectful. When he passed, she found herself nodding slightly, not expecting acknowledgement, but offering recognition of his service and dedication. The morning sun was now bright and warm across the courtyard, but the atmosphere had changed completely from the tense confrontation that had gripped everyone's attention. Victoria Pemberton was no longer the same person who had blocked a guard's path with entitled indignance. The experience had fundamentally altered her understanding of respect, authority, and her place in the broader world. The silence that had fallen everywhere during the confrontation had given way to something deeper, a profound recognition that sometimes the most important lessons come not from books or lectures, but from moments when reality refuses to bend to our expectations. 3 hours after the confrontation, Victoria Pemberton sat in the castle's tea room, her designer outfit still wrinkled, her phone screen still cracked, but her perspective completely transformed. Dr. Morrison and his daughter Sarah had joined her, along with Anna Kowalski and her husband, creating an unlikely group united by their shared witness to the morning's extraordinary events. Victoria stared into a cup of Earl Grey, the steam rising like the fog that had lifted from her understanding. "I keep thinking about how he looked right through me," she said quietly, not with hatred or annoyance, just complete indifference, like I wasn't even there. Dr. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "That's the power of institutional discipline. Personal feelings become irrelevant when you're representing something larger than yourself." The guard wasn't Michael Davies in that moment. He was the embodiment of centuries of British military tradition. "But it felt so personal," Victoria replied, touching her still tender shoulder where Michael's steady advance had moved her backward. "I've never had anyone just ignore my wishes like that. Usually if I'm unhappy with service, I speak to a manager and things get fixed." Anna Kowalski leaned forward, her expression kind but serious. "That's exactly the problem. You treated a sacred duty like a customer service interaction. The Queen's Guard doesn't have managers in the way you understand them. They answer to history itself." Sarah Morrison, who had been quietly listening to the adult conversation, suddenly spoke up. "Were you scared when he wouldn't stop walking toward you?" Her teenage directness cut through the philosophical discussion to the emotional core of what had happened. Victoria considered the question carefully. "Terrified," she admitted. "Not physically scared. I knew he wasn't going to hurt me, but scared of being insignificant, of having my importance just dismissed like that. I've never experienced anything like it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Robert Chen, who had been looking for Victoria throughout the castle grounds. His expression was professional but concerned as he approached their table. "Miss Pemberton, I wanted to check on you one more time. Are you certain you don't need any medical attention?" Victoria shook her head, managing a small smile. "No, I'm fine. Actually, I wanted to apologize to you. My behavior this morning was embarrassing. You handled the situation much better than I deserved." Robert's eyebrows rose slightly. In 2 decades of security work, he had rarely heard such a complete acknowledgement of responsibility from someone who had been involved in a public incident. "That's very gracious of you to say. These situations can be learning experiences for everyone involved." Dr. Morrison gestured to an empty chair. "Please, join us. We were just discussing the cultural implications of what happened this morning. Your perspective would be valuable." As Robert settled into the conversation, Victoria found herself asking questions she had never considered before. "How often does this happen? Do tourists regularly challenge the guards like I did?" "More often than you might think," Robert replied diplomatically. "Usually it's resolved with a quiet word before things escalate. What made this morning unusual was your determination to maintain your position." Victoria winced. "My stubbornness, you mean? I was so focused on being right that I couldn't see how wrong I was being." Anna's husband, Piotr, had been quietly observing the conversation while struggling with his English. Finally, he spoke slowly and carefully. "In Poland, we have saying you cannot move mountain by shouting at it. Some things, they do not bend for any person." The simple wisdom of his words resonated through the group. Victoria nodded, understanding immediately. "I was trying to move a mountain, wasn't I? 200 years of tradition, and I thought I could just ask it to step aside for my convenience." Dr. Morrison pulled out a small notebook, his academic instincts engaging. "What's fascinating is how quickly the entire dynamic shifted once you were no longer in the guard's direct path. The moment his ceremonial requirements were satisfied, the confrontation simply ended." "That's what I can't get over," Victoria said, shaking her head. "I expected anger, argument, some kind of personal response. Instead, I got treated like a piece of furniture that needed to be moved. It was humbling in a way I've never experienced." Sarah Morrison looked up from her phone, where she had been researching Queen's Guard protocols. "Dad, it says here that guards are specifically trained never to break character, no matter what happens around them. They've had people try to make them laugh, get angry, everything. And that's exactly what makes their discipline so powerful," Dr. Morrison explained. "It's not personal discipline, it's institutional discipline. They're not representing themselves. They're representing something eternal." Victoria's phone, despite its cracked screen, had been buzzing periodically with notifications. She glanced at it and sighed. "My social media is exploding. Someone recorded what happened and posted it online. I'm becoming famous for all the wrong reasons." Robert Chen's expression grew more serious. "Are the comments hostile?" Sometimes these situations can attract unwanted attention. Victoria scrolled through her notifications, her face reflecting a complex mix of emotions. Actually, no. Most people are supportive, not of my behavior, but of the lesson I learned. Some are sharing their own stories about times they had to learn respect the hard way. Anna smiled. See, your embarrassment has become something positive. You're not the villain of this story. You're someone who learned and grew. Dr. Morrison leaned back in his chair, his historian's mind working. This is actually quite remarkable. We're witnessing the real-time transformation of a cultural incident into a teaching moment. Your experience is already helping others think about respect and tradition. Victoria looked around the table at these strangers who had become unlikely friends through shared witness to her public humiliation and subsequent growth. I came to Windsor Castle to take some photos for social media. I never expected to get a life lesson. The best education often comes when we're not looking for it, Dr. Morrison observed. Universities can teach theory, but real understanding comes from experience. Sarah Morrison, with the straightforwardness of youth, asked, "So what will you do differently now, like when you travel to other places?" Victoria thought carefully before answering, "I think I'll spend more time learning about places before I visit them, understanding what they mean to people, what's sacred, what deserves respect. This morning taught me that my comfort isn't the most important thing in every situation." Piotr nodded approvingly, his limited English not hindering his understanding of Victoria's transformation. Good learning. Respect is universal language. As the afternoon wore on, their impromptu group had attracted other tourists who had witnessed the morning's events. The tea room conversation expanded into a broader discussion about cultural sensitivity, personal growth, and the unexpected ways that travel could change people. Victoria found herself at the center of these conversations, not as someone to be pitied or mocked, but as someone whose experience had catalyzed important discussions about respect, tradition, and humility. Her public embarrassment was transforming into something valuable for everyone involved. The cracked screen of her phone reflected her fractured assumptions about privilege and entitlement, but the conversations flowing around her suggested that sometimes breaking was the first step toward building something better. 6 months later, Victoria Pemberton returned to Windsor Castle, but this time as a completely different person. The designer handbag had been replaced by a simple leather satchel, the expensive outfit swapped for comfortable walking clothes, and most importantly, the entitled attitude had been transformed into genuine curiosity and respect. She carried with her a handwritten letter addressed to Sergeant Michael Davies. Though she knew the chances of delivering it personally were slim, the letter had taken her weeks to write, going through dozens of drafts as she struggled to find words that could adequately express what that confrontation had taught her about herself and the world. Victoria's life had changed dramatically in the months following her viral encounter with tradition. The video of her being steadily pushed backward by an implacable guard had indeed spread across social media, but not in the way she had initially feared. Instead of becoming a target for ridicule, she had become an unexpected symbol of personal growth and learning from mistakes. Dr. Morrison had stayed in contact with her, sharing how he used their encounter as a teaching example in his university courses. Students were fascinated by the real-time demonstration of institutional authority meeting individual entitlement, and Victoria had even been invited to speak to several classes about her experience. Via video call, Anna Kowalski had become a genuine friend, their correspondence bridging the gap between Poland and England through shared understanding of respect for tradition. Anna had visited Victoria in London twice, and they had explored other historic sites together, with Victoria now serving as a knowledgeable and respectful guide rather than an oblivious tourist. The cracked phone from that day had never been repaired. Victoria kept it as a reminder of how her worldview had been shattered and rebuilt. She had started a blog called Lessons in Humility, documenting her travels with a focus on understanding local customs, traditions, and the stories behind ceremonial practices around the world. As Victoria approached the castle gates, she noticed the same respectful distance that tourists maintained around the guards' ceremonial paths. But now she saw something she had missed before, the quiet pride in people's faces as they watched the ancient traditions being maintained with perfect precision. Robert Chen was still working security at the castle, and he recognized Victoria immediately despite her transformed appearance. His face broke into a genuine smile as he approached her. "Miss Pemberton, what a pleasant surprise. You look well." "I feel well," Victoria replied, meaning it completely. "I wanted to come back and see this place with new eyes, and I have something for Sergeant Davies, if it's possible to deliver it." Robert examined the sealed envelope with professional care. "I can certainly pass it along to him. He's actually on duty today, though I'm sure you understand that he can't acknowledge you while performing his ceremonial duties." Victoria laughed, a sound filled with genuine warmth rather than nervous performance. "I wouldn't dream of interrupting him. I've learned something about respecting people's work." As if summoned by their conversation, Michael Davies appeared at the beginning of his ceremonial patrol route. 6 months had passed, but his bearing was identical to that morning when Victoria had learned her most important lesson: precise, dignified, completely focused on his duty. Victoria positioned herself well clear of his path and simply observed. This time, instead of seeing an obstacle to her desires, she saw a living connection to centuries of history. The red uniform represented countless men and women who had served with the same dedication, the same discipline, the same commitment to something larger than themselves. Other tourists gathered to watch the ceremony, and Victoria found herself quietly explaining to a family from Canada what they were witnessing. "The guards aren't just for show," she said softly. "They're active military personnel maintaining traditions that connect us to our history. The discipline you're seeing took years to develop." The Canadian father nodded respectfully. "It's impressive. You can see the dedication in every step." His teenage son, who had started to pull out his phone for a selfie, instead put it away and simply watched with obvious respect as Michael completed his patrol and began the return journey. Victoria experienced something she had never felt during her first visit: genuine awe, not at the pageantry or the photo opportunity, but at the human dedication required to maintain such perfect discipline day after day. Year after year, Dr. Morrison and Sarah had planned to meet Victoria during her return visit, and they found her standing quietly at the edge of the courtyard, tears in her eyes as she watched Michael's measured steps echo off the ancient stones. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Sarah said simply, now old enough to better understand what they had witnessed 6 months earlier. "The way he makes it look effortless." Victoria wiped her eyes and smiled. "I was so busy thinking about myself that morning that I completely missed the actual miracle happening right in front of me. A human being dedicating himself so completely to duty that his personal desires become invisible." Dr. Morrison had brought copies of student essays about the incident, many of which praised Victoria's willingness to acknowledge her mistakes and learn from them publicly. "You've become quite the teaching tool," he said with academic pride. "Your experience helps students understand the difference between theoretical knowledge about respect and actually practicing it." As the afternoon progressed, Victoria found herself in conversations with tourists from around the world, many of whom recognized her from the viral video. But instead of embarrassment, these encounters had become opportunities to discuss cultural sensitivity, personal growth, and the importance of approaching other cultures with humility rather than assumptions. A group of American college students on a study abroad program approached her nervously, having recognized her from their professor's lecture about cultural respect. "Are you really the woman from the guard video?" one asked hesitantly. Victoria smiled warmly. "Guilty as charged, and I hope your professor used my experience to teach you something useful about respecting local traditions." The students relaxed, realizing they weren't dealing with someone defensive about her viral moment. Instead, they found themselves in an impromptu seminar about travel ethics, cultural humility, and the value of being corrected when you're wrong. "The hardest part wasn't being pushed backward," Victoria explained to the students. "It was realizing that my embarrassment was nothing compared to the disrespect I had shown to something sacred to other people. That God wasn't punishing me, he was protecting something precious." As evening approached and the castle prepared to close, Victoria took one final look at the courtyard where her worldview had been fundamentally altered. The ancient stones had witnessed countless moments of history, but few more personally transformative than her encounter with the immovable force of tradition. Robert Chen approached with an update about her letter. "Sergeant Davies asked me to tell you that your letter was received and appreciated. He also wanted you to know that your public acknowledgement of what you learned has been noted positively by the entire Guard unit." Victoria felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the setting sun. Recognition from the man who had taught her such an important lesson meant more than any social media likes or professional accolades ever could. As she walked away from Windsor Castle for the second time, Victoria Pemberton was no longer the same person who had blocked a guard's path with entitled indeed. The silence that had fallen everywhere during that confrontation had been broken by something far more valuable: genuine understanding, lasting humility, and the kind of personal growth that transforms not just individuals, but everyone whose lives they touch.